Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining today's Global Economic Update. We're very excited to have two absolutely fantastic speakers. First of all, we have Professor Joe Nellis from Cranfield University. Joe is a specialist in global macroeconomics, and he'll be sharing his views on the UK economy, both as it stands today and looking forward. Now, many of you will know MHA is the UK member firm of Baker Tilly International, and Baker Tilly International is ranked number 10 globally for accounting and advisory services. We're delighted to have also joining us Jeff George, and Jeff leads the international practice for Baker Tilly International and is based in Baker Tilly, US. So Jeff is really well placed to share his views from the other side of the Atlantic. In terms of the format for today, Joe will be speaking for 30-35 minutes. He'll be followed by Jeff for 10 or 15 minutes or so, and we'll leave plenty of time for Q&A. We also have a facility to ask questions on this call, so do please post your questions and we'll take as many of them as we can at the end of the call. So without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to Joe.
Hi everybody, it's wonderful to be here online with you. I was just reflecting for a moment there. If we move the clock back 18 or 19 months, who could have imagined that we'd have an event like this online? But it is wonderful. I must say I'm enjoying the online world. And I want to share with you my views about the world. I will focus primarily on the UK economy, of course, but I want to set the scene in an international context, although Jeff is very much the expert on the US economy. So without further ado, let me share my screen. And at this stage, you then should see my first slide. I apologize for the background, the virus, but it's still with us. And we're going to live with it, I think, for quite some time. So it's going to create the context, obviously, for the economy going forward. In terms of where we're going, look, prediction at the moment is really very difficult, and here is my upfront excuse. Prediction is very difficult, especially if it's about the future. I think we would all agree with that. You know, it's about trying to get a sense of direction and pace of change, and things can change very, very quickly. But I think there is some evidence to suggest that we have come out of this deep trough of a recession. Various parts of the world are doing quite well. And I want to look forward to the UK for the next 4 or 5 years to give us a sense of where we think we're going. So let me just remind you very, very briefly. I don't want to look back. I want to look forward. Just to remind you what happened during the last 18, 19, 20 months. We have had shocks that none of us have experienced before, both on the supply side of the economy and on the demand side. The supply side shocks, and we're still living with many of these, of course, have been felt in terms of the global supply chains. So we still have those bottlenecks, those container ships across the world, still trying to get goods to markets. We've had, and in the UK, we no longer have the furlough scheme, but many parts of the world, of course, still have problems in terms of available labor supply, as we see in Austria at the moment with a lockdown. So we had quarantines, social distancing, and lockdowns have not gone away totally. Let's hope we don't see too many of those again. But we also had a tremendous fall in business confidence. That's not a surprise, given that we've had the worst crises in living memory, and even longer than that. On the demand side, of course, we had a tremendous fall in consumer confidence. People really were worried, and there was tremendous uncertainty regarding this disease, and it was unknown to all of us. And would the policies that the government put in place, would they really help to pull the economy out of its recession? We're a lot more confident today than we were even 6 months ago. And for many workers, of course, around the world, there was a loss of income and jobs in some cases. And then we had this concept the economists talk about for a long time, but never really hit us until this pandemic, the increase in precautionary savings. You know, we didn't go on holiday. We didn't go to restaurants. We didn't go shopping. We shopped online. We didn't go to cinemas. And so we kept our surplus money, as it were. And this has given rise to quite a significant build-up in what's called precautionary savings, which I will come back to and talk about. Of course, on the demand side, we had a shock in terms of a sharp fall in investment spending across the globe, and particularly in the UK. And that's not good for long-term growth prospects. But I will come back to these points when I look to the future. But the vaccine has arrived. Well, in many countries, still a long way to go across the globe, and there is light at the end of the tunnel. So that's the context in which I'm going to briefly now turn to the global economy, but then move to the UK economy and give some more detail regarding that. These are the latest forecasts that you can get on the global economy. They came out about 4 weeks ago, maybe 3.5 weeks ago from the IMF, and I just present them as data to be discussed. The left-hand side obviously highlights the global economy, and you'll notice the recession last year, a fall of over 3%, was the biggest recession we've had globally, probably since the 1930s. Data wasn't very accurate, of course, back then, but we have had this V-shaped recovery, the bounce back this year, and we will continue to grow sharply next year. 4.9 is still going to be significant growth. The global economy typically grows at around about 4%. In the very good years, maybe 4.2, 4.3. So we're still going to see a strong global economy next year, but thereafter, we're going to get back to some sense of normality. The advanced economies, you'll see in the middle, fell further last year because, well, we had some difficult times, but we bounced back up this year, and then next year there'll be continued growth, but slowing down, as I said. But look at the right-hand side. The emerging markets and developing economies had a much smaller recession last year and have had a bigger bounce back this year, and we expect next year. I want to focus on that just in a few moments, but I think it is significant because the biggest player in that right-hand picture is, of course, China, and that is important to note. Here's the more detailed regional growth forecast from the IMF. Again, the world and the left-hand side. I won't discuss the US too much because Jeff's going to come back to that. I'll just present the figures. You'll see the euro area last year had a very, very sharp fall relative to the rest of the world and has bounced back this year, but not as big as many other parts of the globe. And we'll get back to normality quite quickly. But look to the right-hand side, the extreme right, the emerging and developing Asia. I said China is the dominant player in the emerging and developing economies. Well, they are very much the dominant player in emerging and developing Asia. And what is significant is that last year, in the worst crisis in living memory, the emerging and developing Asia only had a very, very small downturn, 0.8% fall. And then this year, it's been a sharp upturn, and that will continue. I think that's an important point to note, and you may want to come back to that later. There are other parts of the world which perhaps you may want to look at briefly, but you will get a copy of all of these slides, by the way, for sure. Now, I want to put to you a prediction, a view of where the world is moving. I've called this the changing spheres of influence, and I put a question mark deliberately because, you know, this is just my view of the world. It can be challenged, and I'm sure it will be challenged. But when I use the phrase sphere of influence, I'm referring to the power play. The size of the US obviously makes it the biggest sphere of influence. And the countries that are aligned with the USA are part of that sphere of influence. No question about that. However, if I may be allowed to say this, Jeff, to our American friend, I think under Donald Trump's leadership, that influence was damaged globally. And I think with Joe Biden as president, it hasn't been helped very much. Controversial view to express, but I think it's in my opinion, it's correct, but I'm happy to be challenged. It's very important, I think, for the US influence to be stronger, to be even bigger, because the world is changing rapidly, which I'm going to come back to in a few seconds. The EU is a major sphere of influence, but I think many of us will agree the exit of the UK from the EU has diminished the EU's sphere of influence. And on top of that, the EU itself has, some cracks. The northern countries are doing relatively well compared to the Mediterranean countries. And as a result of that, the EU, in terms of a global power, it has an impact, a negative impact. I personally want to see a strong EU. We need a strong EU as a balance of power because of my next point. And I want to put this to you quite directly. I want you to imagine that you are the Chinese government and think about the perception in many parts of the world, particularly in the emerging markets and developing economies. Think of their perception of how the West, of how the advanced economies have behaved in terms of vaccinations around the world. I don't think we look that good. Naturally, we looked after our own people, but I think we haven't been as generous or haven't been perceived to be as generous as we perhaps should have been. As a result of that, I think a vacuum has opened up. And I think China is moving into that space very, very quickly. It was doing this anyway. Its influence has been growing over some years, but I think it has accelerated. And I said to you, imagine you're the Chinese government. Could there be a better time for the Chinese government to go out into the world and say to the emerging and developing economies, we want to help you? Of course, help means we want to buy more of your resources. We want to invest in your countries. But at least they're going to pay for those resources. And of course, I put Russia in brackets here as an alliance and other countries that are aligned to China and Russia. Again, you may not agree with this. I'm giving you my opinion that I think the balance of power globally is changing faster than we would have expected before the pandemic. And this has significant implications for trade relationships in terms of the US v China, the EU v China, and the UK, of course, v China. I think we're going to see an acceleration in this alignment of the spheres of influence. That's all as we're global context. I know Jeff will come back and speak in much greater detail about the US, of course. But let me now move to the UK economy. And just very quickly recap. I almost don't want to look back at last year because we experienced the biggest fall in GDP for 300 years. I know the data wasn't that good 300 years ago, but it's at least it sounds dramatic, and I'm sure it's correct as well. But we have had what we expected to experience is the classic V-shaped rebound. The last time I was online from McIntyre Hudson, I talked about the possibility of a U-shaped rebound, and I'm glad it didn't happen. We talk about the V-shaped, the U-shaped, the W-shaped rebound. Some countries are going to go through this with more lockdowns. Thank goodness we don't talk about the L-shaped. L is hell, where you go down and you stay down. No, we've had the classic anticipated V-shaped rebound this year. Having said that, of course, the latest GDP figures out for Q3, they showed growth of only 1.3% when we expected more after the furlough scheme ended, after we opened up our economy. So 1.3%, while it's good in that quarter, we expected a bit more than that, perhaps 1.5, 1.6%. The growth this year as a whole will be about 6.5%, again, the V-shape, and next year, perhaps 6%. So we're still going to see significant growth next year. But I am an optimist at all times, but let's be realistic and factually correct. When we get back to, by early next year, we'll only get back to where we were 2 years ago. We will have lost 2 years of growth. We'll have gone down and back up. And by sometime, maybe in the first quarter, I hope in the first quarter, we'll be back to where we started before the pandemic. The bounce back that we've seen this year, and we will see it continue next year, obviously reflects resilience in our economy and in the labour market. And we've got to give credit where credit is due. The vaccination program has been incredibly successful. And at the same time, consumers, in terms of their shopping habits and their work habits, and businesses, in terms of their innovations, we've all shown tremendous resilience and innovation in coping with this. And I think we should all congratulate ourselves for that. But sadly, and I wish this was wrong, recovery will slow sharply. And these are the OBR, the Office for Budget Responsibility. These are the independent forecasters' views about where the economy is heading. They use the Treasury model, but they're not political. So they expect in 2023, growth will slow down to perhaps over 2%, in 2024, 1.3%, and 2025, perhaps a little pickup to 1.6%. I have a very strong sense that 1.5% is going to become our norm for many years to come. I'm old enough to remember the booming days of growth of 2.5%, 3.5%, 4%. I think for our economy, we're not likely to see those sorts of growth figures for a very long time, if ever. The reason why I emphasize this is we need growth to pay for the debt that's been built up. We need to grow our way out of this problem of debt, but I don't think it's going to happen quickly. Here's some historical data for you, just very, very briefly, just to highlight what happened last year relative to the previous 80 years. And of course, in that one year, in that one single year last year, it was the biggest drop we've had. Well, I said for 300 years, but we haven't got data going back that far. Even the earlier data is only estimated by the Bank of England, but it's quite a picture. And then the bounce back is significant as well. Let's get up to the present. Again, these are the latest figures, just came out a week or so ago. You'll see the V-shaped recovery I mentioned, and then the bounce back again, up and down, as you see there. I just want you to look at this is a 3-month rolling average over the last decade. On a 3-month rolling average, the UK has not been growing very strongly. We have had some quarters which have been bigger than others, of course, but the 3-month rolling average smooths out the exceptional cases. And so we have been growing very slowly for quite a while. And I don't think that's going to fundamentally change. In fact, I'm pretty certain of that. But I do hope and I do believe in miracles sometimes. If I take the latest figures and the forecasts, take the quarterly figures, the annual figures on a quarterly basis. So this is the annual growth rate measured quarter by quarter. And these are the forecasts from the Office of Budget Responsibility I mentioned earlier. And again, they speak for themselves. They're expecting us to get back to normality, as I say, very quickly in the next year or two, and then perhaps 1.6% by 2025. Again, just for information. Okay, now let's look at some of the details behind this. Again, let's celebrate, let's congratulate the government, actually. I am very grateful to them for what they did, because unemployment is now only 4.3%. Much, much better than many expected, much better than I expected even 6 months ago. And of course, this is due to the furlough scheme and the funding of many corporates around the country. So the government has done a good job in this respect. Unemployment may rise slightly. Remember, the furlough scheme has just ended, but we expect the next month's figures, the November figures, to show a slight increase. It may get to over 5%, it may not. I don't think we need to be overly concerned about this. We had predicted a year ago unemployment of 12%. So this is very good news indeed. And of course, the government has been responsible for much of this. The problem now is, of course, we have labor shortages. I'm sure many of you are well aware of it. We are struggling in some sectors to create enough capacity to satisfy demand and to grow our businesses. So capacity constraints are now a concern. And the danger of this is, of course, is the danger of inflation. I'm going to pause for a moment. I'm very well aware that the Bank of England so far has been relatively relaxed about future inflationary pressures. Yes, they know there's inflation in the system, but they expect it to diminish quite sharply. I'm going to pause, as I said. I'm old enough, that's the second time I've said that, I'm old enough to remember the dark days of the late 1970s, when the UK economy got itself into what became known as a wage spiral, where prices go up and then workers demand and get higher wages, but not paid for through productivity. And higher wages then push up prices as a result because they're not paid for through productivity. Higher prices leads to higher wages. I think there is some danger of this happening. I don't want to exaggerate it, but I say it because of the labor shortages. It's not difficult now to find a job if you want a job. And it's not difficult in some sectors to get a wage rise because of the demand for your labor. So I think there's a concern here that needs to be watched. At the same time as we have low unemployment, we also have the highest long-term unemployment. These are people out of work for more than a year. And I think this may well reflect what is called a scarring effect of the pandemic. If you cut yourself, you may be left with a scar. And for some people, in some sectors, post-pandemic, there is a danger they may remain unemployed for a very long time. Let me give an example, or try to give an example. Think of the number of high street stores that have closed down because shoppers have gone online primarily. The people who served us in the shops in the high street are not the same people who are dealing with us online. And so the danger is that some people in the high street stores may remain unemployed for a long time. That may be a very simplistic example, but just reflect on it. What sectors may be permanently negatively affected? And therefore, is there a danger of certain workers, perhaps at the lower end of the skill set, who may be affected by this? I hope this is not going to happen, but I think the evidence is beginning to highlight this. So in terms of unemployment, these are the Bank of England forecasts, by the way, made in the second quarter. They haven't updated them for the third quarter, but the picture hasn't changed very much. In other words, we expect unemployment now to track downwards. It may go above 5%, as I said, in the next quarter or two, but I don't think it'll go much beyond that. But I did mention job vacancies, and the October figures have just come out. We now have a record number of job vacancies being advertised by employers. And yet we've got labor shortages and we've got long-term unemployed people. But there's a mismatch in terms of skills and in terms of regions. But hiring is now obviously the dominant feature of many markets out there. And who's hiring? Again, these figures just came out. I only got them this morning. So I've just sent the updated version to McIntyre Hudson, so you'll get these, but they've just come out this morning. Who's hiring? Number one is hospitality, hotels, restaurants, etc., etc. And you can see the rest for yourselves: scientific, etc., retailing, manufacturing, administration, education. Again, remarkable. Last month's figures put scientific at number one, hospitality number two. Now it's the other way around. So hospitality really is struggling to get those chefs, those people serving you in restaurants, all the front of staff and the back office staff in the hospitality locations. But I mentioned earlier, the government should be congratulated for helping the economy do it better than we could have expected, better than I expected. But it has come at a price in terms of public sector borrowing. You'll see the figure, the large blue bar here. Nearly 15% of GDP was borrowed last year in terms of the budget deficit. And the government, of course, in the latest budget has forecast a sharp reduction in their annual borrowing and getting back to normality perhaps by 2025, 2026, round about 3.5%. That's going to be difficult given that we're not out of this crisis yet. Of course, there's an election going to happen sometime before 2025. By 2024, we have to have a general election. So their own forecast may well change as they seek to get re-elected. In terms of the history behind this, again, in the last financial year, the government borrowed almost 320 billion. And if you look back through history, you'll see, of course, the two world wars, not surprisingly, led to massive borrowing, as you see on the left-hand side. In terms of the total debt, now, remember, the annual borrowing is adding to a stock of debt, the public sector debt or the national debt. It has now reached approximately 2.2 trillion. Doesn't sound much when you say it quickly, but it does represent 97.6% of GDP. It is the highest percentage since the 1960s. And this is the debt that we're going to pass on to our children and our grandchildren. The good news at the moment is, because government bond yields are so low, the cost of servicing this debt is reasonably affordable. The problem will come when government bond yields start to rise again. Then the cost of servicing the debt will escalate. And of course, the servicing cost of the debt comes out of tax revenue. And the danger is, if the servicing cost doubles or triples, then it's more tax revenue needed to service the debt and less tax revenue to do other things for the economy. So we're in a very fine balance here. The debt is huge, but the servicing costs are affordable. Same with mortgages, of course. The bond yields represent the cost of fixed rate mortgages approximately. And fixed rate mortgages are incredibly cheap at the moment. And that's fine as long as you haven't got to refinance. But in 5 years' time, if the fixed rate mortgages double from 1% to 2%, then there will be a challenge for a number of people. So it's the next 5 years that's going to really be significant in terms of the importance of this debt. Wow, disposable income. So just to give you a definition, income after tax, income after price rises. This is what people can buy with their money in their pockets, having paid tax. And again, a very fine balance here. Just want to highlight something, that in March 2021, the OBR had predicted that we would get back to the 0% line is where we started from, by the way. So the far left-hand side of this graph, the blue line where it cuts the horizontal, that was the beginning of the pandemic. And in March, they predicted that incomes would grow relatively slowly and they wouldn't get back to where they started in real terms by 2024. Well, now the latest figures from the OBR have actually painted a slightly better picture, and that they expect, real household disposable income to get back to where it started before the crisis by sometime in early 2023. That's good news. Of course, it's an average. It doesn't apply to everybody, but it is better than it was just last March in terms of forecasts. In terms of monetary policy, and I mentioned the Bank of England already, again, just as with the government, the central bank has been incredibly supportive. QE, quantitative easing, it has pumped liquidity into the system, and that has driven down bond yields. At the same time, the base rate has been maintained, was reduced and maintained at 0.1%. So the lowest interest rates in our history. Of that, there is no doubt. And I know what you're thinking. When's it going to end? Well, each month now that the Bank of England, the Monetary Policy Committee meets, we're wondering, are they going to start increasing interest rates? So far, they've held them where they are. We thought they were going to raise them a week or so ago. They didn't. I think they've made it very clear, and they're not stupid. They clearly are not going to raise interest rates quickly. When they do rise, they're going to rise very slowly. But I want to emphasize this fine balance between inflation and economic recovery. Traditionally, the Bank of England has only ever considered inflation. That is their job, to manage inflation. However, this pandemic has, I won't say forced, but has made it necessary for them to consider the economic recovery as well. They take a balanced view, and that's good, of course. Here's words from the Bank of England just last August in 2020, but look at the words carefully. This is their official statement. The Monetary Policy Committee does not intend to tighten monetary policy, at least until there is clear evidence that significant progress is being made in eliminating spare capacity. Now, I think we've got very little spare capacity. So I think this particular statement is now coming to the forefront. But they're not achieving the 2% inflation rate. So as spare capacity has diminished, as unemployment, has gone down to 4.3%, as we got capacity problems, got labor shortages, and I do believe we are now as close as we can be to a rise in interest rates. And just to remind you, the MPC meets again on December the 16th. Are they going to raise them then before Christmas? Would they do this? Or will they wait until the February meeting? Let me stick my neck out. I think they might wait until February. And if they do raise them in February, I think it'll be up to 0.25%. No, it's from 0.1 to 0.25. The problem they've got is this, that the energy cap, the price cap on energy, that's going to be lifted next April. And when that cap is lifted, will be another jump in energy prices. So they're going to be looking ahead from February to March to April, and they're looking at potentially more inflation down the line. So if they increase them in December, I'm not surprised. I just think it'll be a little spoiler for Christmas. I'm hoping they'll wait until February. Well, I say hope. Economically, they should raise them sooner rather than later, because we are heading into some troubled waters. In terms of projections for inflation, these are the OBR's views. Remember, and I'm not convinced that they're going to be that inflation will be as short-lived as this diagram suggests. In March, they were projecting inflation at the 2% by 2025. And you'll see from 2020 to 2025, they didn't see many inflationary problems. The problem was now we've had the gas prices, the energy crises, and of course, supply chain problems, etc. We've had a big jump in inflation, and it's going to get perhaps towards 5% even in the next few months. The Bank of England and the OBR agree that it will drop sharply, but not get down to 2%, perhaps until 2024, 2025. So there is going to be, 3 perhaps years of inflationary problems, which will eat away at real household disposable incomes that I mentioned earlier. I'm conscious of time, so I'm just going to be very brief on these figures. We're all interested in house prices, maybe for selfish reasons. And these are the latest figures from Nationwide and Halifax, just come out. These are the October figures. And remarkable to see that house price inflation is still very strong, in fact. But the reason is what I said earlier. Mortgage rates, fixed rate mortgages have never been cheaper. Again, that will not stay where it is indefinitely, but you can get a 5-year fixed rate mortgage now for approximately 1%, which for the UK is remarkable. And of course, for many people, they perceive the cost of the mortgage as cheaper than renting. And so, they're getting on the ladder as soon as possible. But house prices have soared. Let me put this in context. This is the average house price, $265,000 approximately. The average income in this country is approximately $31,000. Now, you can do the math. That's about 8.5 times the average income. The ratio of house prices to average income is about 8.5 times. In my professional career, I've never known this ratio to be so high. Is that sustainable? Well, it's only sustainable as long as mortgages remain so affordable in terms of the mortgage rate. That will not last forever. Here are the latest regional figures as well, for what it's worth. Oh, sorry, I should just go back there. I was too quick. So across the country, we've seen regional house price inflation is very strong. In the parts of the north, incredibly high inflation rates, but even in London, which I think is fully priced, by the way, we still have seen inflation on average across the London region. Okay, and so in terms of outlook, and I'll finish in a few minutes. In terms of outlook, I think consumer spending has still some way to go to support the economy because of the build-up of household savings. The Bank of England estimates that there's been an extra £200 billion worth of precautionary savings during this pandemic, and they're guessing that perhaps 10% of this extra money will be spent as we return to normality. And this is what economists call a multiplier effect, because money isn't only spent once, it goes round the economy again and again and again, and it stimulates the economy through what's called a multiplier effect. On top of that, you may remember in the budget last March, the government announced a super deduction to stimulate investment. It was the first year relief of 130% in capital spend from last April to March 2023. although and this has helped, no question about that, but I would say much more investment spending is needed. So I think the government may have to go back to this again and to create an even bigger stimulus, because, as I've said many times online when I've given this presentation, investment is the engine of growth. We've had a decade of very poor, weak investment in this economy. We need to focus on this for the next decade, and I hope the government is listening. Not just public sector investment, but corporate, private sector investment in skills as well as in infrastructure. But I should make one point, by the way. I'm sure you're well aware of it. The government has put in place planned rises in corporate taxation as well. It just so happens that this super deduction relief, the amount of giveaway is matched more or less by the amount of tax they're going to get back through the increase in corporate tax. So they give on the one hand, they're going to take on the other hand. The question is, will the planned increase in corporate tax really happen? I think it's starting from 2023, because there may be another, well, there will be another election sometime close to that point. So I just wonder, are we really going to see corporate taxes rise as sharply as is planned at the moment? So to finish off, challenges that lie ahead. The pandemic is going to stay with us for some time, and the social impact is clearly immense in terms of personal well-being, mental health, physical wealth, and of course in terms of certain sectors being hit harder than other sectors. And then taking all this combined, we're facing a challenge in terms of dealing with the NHS and social care costs. I don't need to expand on that. We're all well aware of it. Then what about returning to the office? How many of us want to go back to the office full time? How many civil servants want to go back full time? I hear the government is struggling to get the civil servants to go back because we've got used to this flexible hybrid world that we now live in. And of course, the levelling up agenda has been talked about a lot in the last few days. And the high-speed rail decisions and the cancellation of some parts of high-speed rail is a challenge for this country. And I really do want the government to reflect on this and to really think about how much more investment is needed in the northern half of the country. And I think that is correct to say that. And then, of course, we got the EU to deal with. When will we get back to normal trading relationships? Because the EU is still our biggest trading partner by far. More than 40% of all exports and imports are with the EU. So let me finish just by highlighting what I see as some of the risks ahead to the forecast that I've tried to share with you. Clearly, growth, at 1.6% by 2025 is okay, but any slower than that, I think, is a serious risk for the economy. I am very concerned about the weakness of business investment. And I mentioned productivity. We have not been a high productivity economy for quite some time. And investment is the engine of growth. So I really want the government to stimulate investment even more. Inflation, so the Bank of England is reasonably relaxed about it. I'm less relaxed. And I am concerned, therefore, that interest rates, well, they will go up. But how far are they going to go up is to be seen. The scarring effect I mentioned, certain sectors, certain groups, I think are still going to struggle to recover from this pandemic. And then, of course, the cost of servicing the government debt is going to be with us for decades. And then what other future tax increases are in the pipeline? Not just the corporate tax increases, but I think there's more tax increases to come in the future, which we don't know about yet. And we've got to deal with these supply chain bottlenecks and labor shortages. And that's not going to be a short-term solution, by the way, or short-term problem to be solved. We've seen already the slow improvement in household finances. Any rise in inflation will make that improvement even slower. And then, of course, I hope there are no more variants, but who knows? I don't know. And last but not least, we've still got to deal with the EU, and we have not resolved the problems of the trade between Northern Ireland and the UK, and that could cause more frictions in the future. And so my very last slide in conclusion is this. I think these are important words for the Institute of Fiscal Studies, which summarize, I think, a lot of my own views. Adjustment to a post-COVID, post-Brexit new normal will have economic costs that last into the long term. On that happy note, Thank you for listening, and I'll look forward to some questions later. Thank you so much. I'm going to stop sharing now and pass over to Jeff.
Joe, thank you so much. Tremendous overview. Certainly our intent today was not necessarily to be the motivational speakers, although I think there are a lot of silver linings in what you shared that I think are also a parallel to what we see taking place in the US. So thank you so much again, everyone, for joining us today. Joe, tremendous insight. We really appreciate you coalescing this and sharing a perspective with all of us, because curiously, there are some very interesting parallels with the US economy. Again, my name is Jeff George. I'm a partner at Baker Tilly in the US. We are a member firm of Baker Tilly International and the partner firm to MHA in the US. In my role, I am responsible for helping our clients thrive across the 145 countries where we as a firm and our clients do business in. In addition to this role, I'm also responsible for bringing our supply chain services to market, which, as you can imagine, has been an eventful part of our work. One item of context that I think is pertinent to today's session is that we're talking about a global economic outlook, the respective role of the UK and the US in that stage. And I'm pleased to say that I happen to bring a dual national view to our session today. Specifically, even though I live in the US, I'm a part of our US member firm, and I've lived in the US for 25 plus years. I was actually born and grew up in Latin America. I'm Brazilian by birth. I started my college education in Brazil. I started my career in Brazil. And even though I've lived in North America, Latin America, and even Europe in my career, I find that it helps to have been a global citizen in sharing a perspective from us in the US and our country's relationship with the UK, as well as the broader global economy. So as Joe mentioned, we have some very interesting parallels between the UK and the US, which I think in the favorable parallels, it's actually a very healthy thing. The reason why I believe it's healthy is because when you have two major economies such as the US and the UK, where we have such an influential role in capital markets, this stability, this alignment is, I think, essential for predictability of action, for markets to be stable, and ideally for economies to work more cohesively than perhaps they have in the past. So, when I think about where we've been as a country, as where we're going as a country, and where else where we've been as a global economy and where we're headed, I find that there are fewer moments in history where cohesion among us as a civilization are so key, right? And beyond a global public health crisis, we have climate change, we have social and economic inequality. In some ways, some might consider that we have brewing military unrest among varying global powers. I mean, this is a challenging time, and cohesion and unity is what I have looked upon as the filter through which find solutions and a path through moments of challenge, as we've experienced, not through the pandemic, but also through supply chain and a number of other variables. So, what I can share with you about the US economy and that I'm going to do today, in a way, can provide a frame through which you can see what could be ahead. My approach here is not to predict what will happen, but rather to provide some context on how things have been shaped historically, such that they can inform how things may be shaping up in the future. I'll share with you patterns of behavior across administrations, what that might mean for the country and its relationship with both the UK and the world at large. So let's go ahead and jump in. Again, we're not in the business of prediction, but I am going to share a perspective that hopefully can frame some things for you. You're welcome to take notes. Just like Joe mentioned, these slides will be made available after today's session. We invite you to come to our respective websites, both MHA and Baker Tilly US. We have a continual stream of article that we publish. We have thought leadership, insights, tools, and resources to support your business during times of both change and stability. And I would be remiss if I did not mention one of our rising stars here in our firm, Alexis Flichek, who provided some very welcome support as we compile the content for our session today on things that were changing as recently as Friday. as we aim to share insights and indexes to help provide a perspective on what's happened in the US and its connection to the world. So to such end, here in the US, we're entering the end of a new presidential term. We have a new party in the White House. We have a new balance of weight in the legislative body of the US, which our Congress is made of the House and the Senate, a tiered system. The House takes the input from the populace and its constituency as to what should be recommended to be turned into law and applied into the legislative body, which then gets moved up to the Senate, and the Senate then votes on whether it'll go to the desk of the president for signature and approval, and therefore being enacted into policy and economic stance in the country. So why does that matter, right? It matters because economic policy is often in the image of the party in power. Some of those images, that reflection, doesn't change much because they're a reflection of what the economy at a macro level requires a country to do. And we thought it'd be insightful to share a perspective on the average economic growth relative to prior times and prior administrations. So we tend to see, yes, there are ups and downs, right? In the 2008, 2009 economic global meltdown, the U.S. was obviously not immune to that, right? There were massive rescue plans by the government under the Obama administration, but the rebound was by and large a very prosperous time for the U.S., which, you know, there was a change, as it normally happens as administrations change hand. Some might argue the economic policy under Obama inflicted the economic pain that we see on the chart as things dropped towards the end of the Obama administration. But there are many very good things that happened following the Obama administration. We had I think a global economic stage of prosperity that happened under President Donald Trump. It continued to reflect itself in the economic markets. There were headwinds, no doubt, some of which were self-inflicted in the name of economic policy and economic stance. But you see that, you know, obviously we had a sharp drop in economic activity during the early days of 2020, obviously due to the pandemic. But we have seen a resilience in the U.S. economy, and it has continued to perform. So by and large, stable, not you know, to the tune of what we see, for example, in China with growth rates, but certainly a stable economy that has provided for, I think, a good infusion of capital into capital markets. It has attractive foreign direct capital investment. And the monetary policy that has driven some of these numbers as it relates to interest rates is rather interesting. This is a snapshot from January of 2015 to just about now. The vertical gray bar indicate a recession, right? And this is coming from the Federal Reserve, which determines the interest rates and the borrowing rates within the U.S. This is historic in this particular chart from 2015 onward. Naturally, you had that drop in the early 2020 due to the pandemic. The U.S. Federal Reserve in the U.S. made an adjustment back in 2015, but has materially kept interest rates somewhat at bay at that under 2.5%. That said, when you think, boy, you know, this interest rate is rising, you know, we've made a sharp drop, we've cut it, but the reality, you know, if you go back a generation or two ago, it doesn't look so bad, because back in the 80s, there was nearly 20%. Now, even at that, for me, you know, who grew up, and for those of us who grew up in Brazil at a time when Brazil coined the term hyperinflation, where we had over 50% inflation a month, we look at this kind of an interest rate and it doesn't feel so bad, right? So these are historic times, right? If you look here at the very tip in the far right of the timeline, these are historically low interest rates for the U.S., super low borrowing rates. So nearly all of the indexes that we have and we've brought to you today, this is one of the ones where there's very little impact in terms of what administration is in power as to what happens to interest rates. Why? Because it's driven by macroeconomic forces, things that that administration may have no real control over. And therefore, because it doesn't matter who's in power, you have to do what's right by the broad economic health. So one of the themes here is that the Fed chair, so the person leading the decisions on whether to raise, lower, or maintain interest rates, it's a person who often is carried among administrations. So carrying into this theme of administration transitions, right, I think it's helpful to know that the federal debt has also changed over time for a few different reasons, most clearly marked by, in this case here, funding of World War II Bellic arsenal. From that point on, the 1980s had less to do with the military needs, but more with the financing of new housing starts and the advent of credit cards until we reached the 2008 global economic crisis. But what you see here is what happens to the federal debt as a percentage of GDP across the party of who is in power at the White House. And you'll notice that the debt, while it may seem that it may rise and fall and somewhat be dominated by parties, you see that it can rise under a Democratic presidential leadership, just as it can under a Republican leadership. So, of note here is that the federal debt rises and falls irrespective of the party in control of the White House. And this is partly due to the circumstances that surround each administration, which we find is also connected into the control of the House and the Senate, which I mentioned earlier, which in recent years have become mired in gridlock. Often the approvals of whether the budget ceiling, therefore the debt ceiling, is raised or not, coming down to the wire, often hours before the ratification is required for the government to continue to function. So these approvals in the last 3 administrations, by and large, have been passed under duress, under a complete state of gridlock due to bipartisan behavior. And this really is a state in which we find ourselves in the US, where the art of the compromise has seen, unfortunately, a fall from vogue from years past and how things used to be done. So this illustration here only goes through 2017, but it helps to see where we are now, both on an absolute basis as well as historically. And when it comes to the federal debt, we're experiencing something very similar to what the UK has seen, right? Since the early 2000s, right after the dot-com bust, the debt ceiling levels have increasingly been raised rather sharply. And it's reaching what I call worrisome levels that right now they exceed our domestic output in terms of economic production by almost 10%, which if historically, right, it's only as high as what we saw in the throes of World War II. And while we are, as a country, connected into military activity globally, as the UK is as well, to varying degrees for varying reasons, it's worrisome that only now we would see something that is such at a high level as it was in terms of debt held by the public as a percentage of GDP. So we have to spur economic activity. We have to put our country in a position where we can lower this picture in the federal debt, but the reality is the number is extraordinarily high. And curiously, some of that debt held by the public is tied to federal housing. A significant portion of the U.S. federal debt is pinned to housing and the backing of mortgage-backed securities. That is an interesting parallel against the U.S., right? That the reality is housing prices have been, in very technical terms, absolutely nuts. It's a reality that defies logic a bit. And one of the barometers for a strength of the housing market is the turnover rate, meaning that, what is the average number of days that when a house goes on the market, a private real estate, not commercial, but for an individual, right, for a family, the number of days that that house stays in the market from when it's put up for sale. And pre-pandemic, a strong housing market would be about 6 months inventory turnover. So put a house in the market, takes about 6 months and it sells. By and large, 6 months turnover was a good, strong market. A really hot seller's market historically would have been about 3 months. Just a few days ago, that turnover rate was 0.1 month, meaning a house would go on the market for about 3 days and it would sell. It's unreal. And though that has cooled down a little bit, it remains exceedingly high. And this creates for what we call an unusual environment in lots of ways, right? There are supply chain and labor constraints that give way to permission to charge more for goods and services, right? This is an opportunity for companies to say, look, products are not as readily available because of supply chains. People by and large are employed. They are productive from home. We're going to price things under the auspices of supply chain is tight. The availability of supply of goods isn't as great. And as a result, we're going to take some price out. The proof in the broad entity profitability is that this price taking is outpacing inflation. It's increased inflationary pressures domestically in the US and abroad. And what it has done is had an impact on CPI. And CPI is the consumer price index that the Labor of Statistics in the US does. It measures price fluctuation in a basket of goods and services. And this has continued to rise. It hasn't been this rise in a long time, which means that the cost of living is going up and therefore inflation is going to happen. So for many businesses, this is an opportunity to continue charging more and having a really good, essentially profitability. So we've seen a 6% increase in this price index in 18 months. You know, Joe, you mentioned the scarring effect of the economy. This is one of those patterns that we'll see. So there are a number of challenges facing the U.S. as far as economic rebound goes. There's an increased consumer demand. There's decrease in labor force participation, right? Unemployment is low. People are not coming into work even though they're on the sidelines. And there's demand for labor. Vaccination rates are going to play a role in whether the economy really comes back to full functioning. Supply chain shortages will continue. Inflation will continue to rise. Because of time here, I'm not going to belabor the labor shortage. But there is a bit of a buffering effect from the standpoint that there's demand, but people are not coming back into the workforce, which has again created some pressures. We see supply chain bottlenecks lasting well into 2023. There's a shortage of containers. There's a shortage of ship dock workers to release the containers from boat to shore. Once it's in shore, there's a shortage of truck beds to carry those containers to the distribution points. There's shortage of drivers and warehouse workers. So all of that creates a massive bottleneck for the future. And jokingly, we say that if you're tracking your Amazon package coming into the US, it's probably right there on top of that boat. The economic outlook is one where we see some tightness, right? There's an expected average growth of GDP of 2.6%, which through 21 to 25. Others are saying that it might be lower than that. The budget deficit might have an impact in this as well. But ultimately, we're coming to a point where it's a polarized global economy, right? And one where the US and China are continuing to rise to prominence. And in that rising, there are tensions that are developing. And I think one of the striking elements of this dynamic is the timeline in which our economies make decisions, right? In the US, it's usually a 3-year cycle in presidential races. Even though it's a 4-year cycle of presidency, it's really 3 years of administration plus 1 year of campaigning, which doesn't bode well when it comes to the Chinese economy that makes decisions on a multi-generational basis, often on a 50 to 75 year time horizon. So they as an economy are playing a different game than we as a U.S. economy are. And you know the news headings abound, right? There are trade tensions. They continue to build. There are lots of dynamics that happen, and the tariffs have been a big piece of that, right? And they haven't been eased off. They, by and large, have remained the same a year into the Biden administration. The deficit with China continues to increase, and the reality is this puts, I think, pressure on the UK and the US to find a way to better work together, right? How do we nurture this special relationship? How do we create a free trade agreement that maybe hasn't been as functional under the prior administration that could work going forward? Is it likely? Curious to hear your questions and your comments as we go into the Q&A here in just a few moments. What is the role of international politics in this relationship and this dynamic. What are the ramifications on any existing US-EU agreements for the UK? But I think finding alignment is a key element of maintaining balance in the shifting sands of global power, especially as the world becomes more polarized between China and the US. I'll leave this with you as a last snapshot, right? The value of exports between UK and the US. We continue to be two of each other's largest trading partners. We continue to be two of our largest foreign direct capital investment and two-way direct investment, where to ignore that relationship for our sustainability and stability, I think would be to our detriment. So lastly, right before we go into Q&A, the parallels, and actually our friend Joe was the one who encapsulated this for us. These are all parallels that we see between the two economies, right? Economic growth might be tight. Budget deficits will likely continue. It'll take a lot of growth to eat that debt down. And that will cause some inflation to happen. Markets will have some bubbles, both economic markets as well as housing. Supply chains are going to be a little tight. But ultimately, even though we have headwinds, I think we also have an opportunity to strengthen the relationship between UK and the US, to share best practices, to seek a path to improve trade between our countries, and to really create a more united front in the global stage for growth and stability. And Joe and Atul, I find that growth and stability is both deserved and achievable. So with that, I welcome you back in for both video and audio so that we can transition into our Q&A.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Joe. I can hear the virtual applause ringing through our room. So look, so for those in the audience, if you do have questions, do please tap them in the kind of Q&A function. But we do have a couple of questions that have come in. Now, perhaps, Joe, if you could take this first, but I think equally relevant to Jeff. Both presentations mentioned kind of the high federal debt, high public sector borrowing, kind of going through the roof, unprecedented high levels. Joe, how do you see this debt being paid back, given that both presentations said the growth forecast would be relatively modest? I mean, kind of what's your take on that?
Well, first of all, the acceleration of the debt was inevitable. Imagine what would have happened if our governments had not done what they did. So we've just been through we're still in the biggest crisis in living memory. Now, the golden scenario, and Jeff mentioned as well, would be growth to pay back the debt. In other words, growth in the economies will grow the tax revenues, but I don't think it's going to be as strong as we would wish. And that's why I hinted earlier, I think there are more tax rises in the pipeline. You're going to ask me which taxes. Well, I think all taxes. The government, maybe more so in the UK than in the USA, but the government, they take a bit here and a bit there, as if we're not going to notice it. But I think we are going to see an increased tax burden. Of course, the biggest, the most significant way the government's going to collect money is through fiscal drag. But by freezing or not raising tax thresholds very quickly in line with inflation, inflation is going to solve the problem. And there's the main point. If you go back in time, this scale of debt has usually been eradicated because of inflation. And this is being recorded, so no doubt I'll get in trouble. But I think the government, if they were being honest, might actually say they don't mind a bit of inflation for the next 5 or 6 years. And central banks probably will go along with that, even though they're supposed to control inflation. So I think inflation, a little bit of growth, but more tax rise in the pipeline is my answer to your question.
And Atul, I'll comment here. Joe, I think you're spot on. And the deficit that has been incurred and the debt that has been leveraged, if you think to what just happened in 2020 during the pandemic, and I shared that graph of the rising federal debt as a percentage of GDP that for the US dates back to only as high to war times in World War II. Those are roles that only the government can play. There's no one else in the economy that can come to the aid at that scale for those reasons other than government, right? So economic prosperity, I think, is both the antidote to paying down debt. I think it also has an effect in how do we bring that prosperity with economic trading partners, because that will also help to ease the debt, right, that may be held by other countries. I think it helps even with immigration, right? I hear often, what's happening with immigration in the U.S. Well, the U.S. has, oftentimes a contentious relationship with Mexico when it comes to immigration. Well, one of the best immigration policies is prosperity. Help your neighboring countries to be prosperous, and people immigrate less, right? So I think that growth is healthy, and I also agree with you, Joe. I think that there's an appetite for a little bit of inflation. I think both economies can handle the inflation. People are, by and large, well employed, right? You have a low unemployment rate in the UK. We have a low unemployment rate in the US. So I think that both countries can spare to have a little inflation to keep pace with what's happening, but also to drive some growth.
So I'm guessing there that the answer is a bit of inflation is a good thing, and we obviously need the growth. And I'm guessing this is very much long term debt passed on through the generations.
Yeah, I mean, I just to take that point. I mean, I would say a bit of inflation is a good thing. I mean, I remember the days when Margaret Thatcher set an inflation target of 0, and I think that was, the wrong thing. Inflation acts as a spur to be more efficient, to be more competitive. It actually is good for an economy. Inflation is bad when it's volatile. It's when it's up and down, up, as you saw in Brazil, Jeff. Sorry, I remember Brazil very well. Clearly, we're not into that scenario. So I think if inflation were to be 3% or 3.5% for a few years, that would not be the end of the world at all.
Thank you both. Joe, another question coming through. In your presentation, you mentioned that we needed investment in the economy to stimulate growth. Kind of corporate balance sheets were there. We needed that flow through in the economy. Given how the accelerated capital allowances wasn't so much of a giveaway, what do you think needs to happen there to kind of get that moving?
I told you, this is one of my biggest worries, probably the biggest worry I've got for the UK economy. And Jeff may have a viewpoint about the US. I know Biden's announced the $1 trillion investment plan, which public sector plan, which is great. But look, our productivity in the UK, to give you some data, if you go back to 1970 and you look at the average productivity of the UK economy from 1970 up to 2010, that's a 40-year period. And the average was 2.4%. That's the official figure. And that's the long-term growth of the economy, growing through productivity. Since 2010 until today, productivity has barely increased, marginal increases. And that means we have lost a decade of growth that we should have had. And the reason why we didn't have it is because we've had decades of underinvestment. And I've said this for many years and at many McIntyre Hudson presentations. If I were the government, I would put in place a long-term plan to support corporate investment. It's okay for the government to spend billions on roads and high-speed rails, which will take 30 years to pay back. We need to do it now. And I think only the corporate sector can do this. And I've said that for many, many years, by the way. And I think that's the biggest problem we face in this country. Investment is the engine of growth everywhere.
And Joe, if I can, Atul, if I may, because this is a really interesting point you're making here, Joe. And I'm asking because I'm not entirely certain, so I'm curious on your take on this. How much does the role of the manufacturing sector play in that productivity? How would you characterize the UK economy in its dependence in the industrial sector, the value-added sector of changing physical goods and bringing them to market? How much does that play a role, and has it changed over the years? Meaning, does the UK make less physical things than it once did?
You've answered the question, Jeff. Manufacturing in this country versus services is less than 20% of the whole economy and has been declining for a very long time. Well, relative to the financial services sector, let's be clear, it's the massive growth of financial services. And there's part of the dilemma, which I referred to earlier. Where is our financial sector, where is it most dominant? In the bottom half of the country. And that has given this leveling up agenda, some importance. But it is possible in certain parts of the service sector to have significant productivity improvements. That is absolutely true. But it's not true in restaurants, it's not true in hotels, it's not true in the other parts of the service sector. So we get a very divided economy. But the answer to your question is what you just said. We've moved towards services over many, many years, and the productivity improvements, well, I think they could have come through, but have not come through for at least the last decade. And we're going to have to catch up for a very long time. As I say, I'm old enough to remember the 1979 House of Lords All-Party Select Committee report on the UK. And it was a report on what went wrong in the UK. Essentially, we hadn't replaced machinery quick enough with new machinery. We were using the good old British machine, still working after 50 years. This was the mentality. Well, not a lot has changed in some ways. We still got the old roads, the old airports. We're changing, but we have fallen behind, I think, in the global race. Whereas China, by the way, of course, they start from a different baseline and are able to invest in everything that they want to invest in.
Yeah, I think I can't disagree with that. And the manufacturing engineering sector is one that's close to my heart. The only thing I would add is that the UK R&D, so research and development tax credit reliefs, are some of the most generous in Europe, but of course they don't go far enough. We all know that, and the productivity issue was there long before this pandemic. Jeff, a question for you really. Really encouraged to kind of hear your comments around the special relationship between the UK and the US. But the headlines in the UK are very much along the lines of perhaps the UK isn't going to get a particularly favourable trade deal with the US simply because they're out of the EU. What are the headlines and what's the feeling kind of from your side of the Atlantic?
It's a similar headline, though one that is laced with hope because of the perspective of global unity. There's a sentiment that there needs to be an improved trade relationship with the UK. There's also a recognition that there are internal dynamics that we as a trading partner don't control or even influence, such as what happens with Northern Ireland and therefore the relationship with the EU. So it's recognized as tenuous, but one that is seen as essential if we want to continue having both an influential role in global economy, but also to strengthen ties that go beyond economic, right? They go into military security, diplomatic relations, and so forth. So similar sentiments, but one that is laced with hope because we see the importance that it has.
Good. I certainly share that hope, and as I'm sure many others do. So just a couple of questions, really, perhaps to both of you. Joe, if you can take this one first. If there were two things that you would do to kind of, if you're in government and there are a couple of things you could do and change overnight, well, really putting you on the spot there, I can see. What are your takes on that? And I appreciate it.
The first thing is I wouldn't start from here, but we are here for sure.
Of course.
I would absolutely put in place a longer term incentive for corporate investment. The 1 or 2 year window is not enough. So I would absolutely put in place, if it's 5 years, fine, even 10 years, because I'll say it again for the third or fourth time, investment is the engine of growth. The truth is, on top of all of that, I don't think the government have done many things wrong. It's easy to spend when you have to spend. So they did the right thing. The problem now is, can they reverse this? Can they get us back to normality in a time period that is going to be significant, relevant? And I think there, if I was the government, personally, and I say this, and I've said it earlier, I would spend a hell of a lot more money, and if that means borrowing, so be it, on the northern part of the country. That may offend some people online, but I really think we've got a serious problem because it will create a massive spending stimulus. This will not be wasted money. So I think they've made some mistakes. High-speed rail, 30-year plans don't excite me that much. They could do a hell of a lot more in the next 5 years, and I think they should. So, I wouldn't start from where I am, but I would definitely put in place more incentive for the corporate sector to invest longer term, and don't just do it short-term stimulus. and I would also spend a lot more in the north. The south is not going to go into a crisis. We're still very, very strong.
And
Jeff, did you have a take on that?
Yes, I do. I agree with Joe that where I believe there can be a massive impact in recovery and paying down debt is really to fostering a private sector, especially in goods production and direct services, that would do a few things, right? One, it will sharply increase GDP, right? We will increase productivity, and by doing that, you also increase the tax base from which the government taxes corporations. It'll also do the same for the broader prosperity of those who are employed by the business, right? Individuals and their income and their taxes. So I find that I'm in 100% agreement with Joe, and in that the private sector will be, I think, a big key for what things can change in the future. The other is I would consider a very, very small, but still a rate increase. I think that an adjustment on the federal borrowing rate will also help offset some of the things that we're seeing now.
Yeah, just to add to that, if I may, Atul, the announcement this morning by AstraZeneca of a £1 billion investment in Cambridge is a very positive sign. But you know, Cambridge is what we call in the UK and what you call in California a cluster. Silicon Valley is a cluster. We don't have enough clusters in this country. I think we need to, and this is Michael Porter's jargon, we need many more clusters all over the country, but not only in Cambridge. I think we need to push investment elsewhere as well. But thankfully, AstraZeneca's investment is very welcome this morning.
Well, that's definitely welcome news, and certainly for pharmaceuticals, Cambridge is kind of the number one cluster in the UK. For what it's worth, I don't think, Joe, I don't think corporation tax rates will go up as planned, but that's just, you know, speculation. And
I hinted that earlier as well. I just wonder, pre-election, are they really going to do it? What they plan to do? I'm not sure. I agree with you, but we're guessing. We're second guessing the government here.
Excellent. So look, we'll bring this to a close very shortly, but thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Joe, once again for an absolutely fantastic presentation, really insightful. For those in the audience, you will receive a link following this presentation, so following this webinar. It will have all the details of the slides and the information. They're also on the MHA Hub website and the Baker Tilly US website. So thank you once again, and I can hear the virtual applause for our speakers here around the room once again. So look, thank you all today. Really appreciate you attending, and we'll bring this webinar to a close. So thank you once again. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone.